Hey guys, tonight we are heading straight into a courtyard just as dawn slips over the tiled rooftops of an ancient Chinese home. The air is cool enough to make you shiver, and somewhere a rooster is already auditioning for the role of alarm clock. Clay jars sweat with dew, the sky is just barely pink, and you can hear the first clatter of someone rinsing last night's rice. You probably won't survive this morning if you're expecting a silent, meditative sunrise, because life here wakes up noisy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the time where you are. I love seeing just how far this little bedtime community reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand barefoot on packed earth, watching the household stir. A servant squats near the big stone mill, dropping soaked soybeans into the top. You hear the heavy, gritty sound as she pushes the wooden handle, turning the millstone until pale soy milk trickles down into a waiting clay pot. The sound is almost hypnotic, stone grinding against stone, a low groan every time the wheel needs an extra shove. It smells faintly nutty, and somewhere behind you a chicken flaps indignantly when someone steals its warm egg from the coop. Near the kitchen, a child uses a tall wooden pestle to pound rice in a deep mortar, and every thud echoes off the courtyard walls. Historians still argue whether pounding rice this early was purely a morning task or an all-day rhythm whenever there was grain to process, but whatever the case, you can practically feel the vibration through your toes. This pounding isn't just noise, it's music for the household, the percussion track of survival. A woman hauls up a bucket from the well with a rope, and you hear that distinctive squeal of the pulley, followed by the satisfying splash as the bucket clears the rim. When she tips it into the waiting jar, the splash is deep and hollow, ancient acoustic perfection. These big ceramic water jars are like the sound systems of the house, each one ringing slightly differently depending on how full it is. Then there's the sound of fire waking up. Someone takes a bamboo tube and blows into the ashes in the stove, hoof, and the embers glow bright, the dry kindling crackles and snaps, and suddenly the kitchen smells alive. The first hiss of the iron pot heating up is so sharp you almost flinch. If you've ever heard a wok scream at you when you drop in oil, you know that exact sound. It hasn't changed in 2,000 years. As breakfast preparations hum along, a dog pads through the courtyard, claws clicking on stone tiles, and barks at nothing in particular, because dogs have always done that. Meanwhile, you can hear the muted gossip of women as they sweep with twig brooms, the scratchy swish marking out neat lines in the dust. And because we're honest here, the occasional grunt of someone relieving themselves in the corner latrine reminds you this is a living house, not a museum diorama. One quirky little detail. Some wealthy households kept pet crickets in bamboo cages right by the kitchen window so they could enjoy their song at dawn. Yes, they basically had bug sound machines before Spotify playlists existed. The crickets chirp softly even as the rest of the courtyard grows noisy, making the soundscape feel strangely balanced, like nature's own white noise machine working overtime. When you step toward the kitchen door, you hear the rhythmic scraping of a kitchen knife on a whetstone. The cook sharpens it with long, patient strokes, because a dull knife is a dangerous knife, even in 200 BCE. The sound is faint but insistent, and it promises that breakfast is about to involve some seriously precise chopping. The rice is now rinsed in a bamboo basket, water splashing and dripping in uneven beats. The grains patter like rain as she tips them into the pot, and soon there's the muffled bubbling of congee simmering. That bubbling is oddly soothing, one of those sounds that could put you right back to sleep if you weren't secretly watching everything like it's a Netflix documentary. Finally, a gong somewhere down the lane rings once, deep and resonant, telling neighbors that the village gates are opening for the day. The entire courtyard seems to pause for just a moment at that sound, as if the whole world has been cued to start its morning. And just like that, you're wide awake in ancient China, standing in a courtyard full of clatter and warmth and steam, knowing that the day's real noise hasn't even started yet. The courtyard smell of breakfast follows you as you duck into a dim side room, where the air feels softer and strangely alive. This is the textile space, the heart of silk production, and even before your eyes adjust, you hear it, the faint, papery rustle of cocoons being sorted in baskets. It's a delicate sound, like shaking a bag of packing peanuts, and you almost laugh thinking that this is the first step to making robes worth more than gold. At the far end, someone sits at a low stool, pulling thread from warm, softened cocoons. The reel spins with a light whir, its wooden axle squeaking every so often. The thread itself almost hums as it's stretched, impossibly fine but strong, and your fingertips itch with the urge to touch it. Historians still argue whether households produced enough silk for their own clothing or mostly for tribute to the state, but either way, it's clear this is an all-hands job, no idle corners here. The room is never silent. Even the spindle, a simple stick weighted with clay, makes its presence known. It clicks softly when spun, the thread winding into tidy cones of gleaming fiber. Every so often one of the women gives the spindle a flick that's a little too hard, and it rattles against the floor with a wooden talk, prompting a round of suppressed laughter. You get the sense that even 2,000 years ago, people turned repetitive labor into low-key social time. And then comes the loom, oh, the loom. The first clack makes you jump, and then the rhythm sets in, shuttle sliding, threads snapping taut, heddles lifting with a little whump. It's hypnotic, a perfect back-and-forth soundtrack. The weaver pushes the beater bar forward and it lands with a resonant thud, like the downbeat of a drum. You realize that if you sat here long enough, you could tell exactly how fast the cloth was growing just by the sound. The smell is a mix of hot water, raw silk, and pine smoke from the little brazier heating the reeling pot. It clings to your clothes, to your hair. You sneeze once, which earns you a sympathetic grin from the nearest worker. Apparently silk dust was the ancient world's version of seasonal allergies. One quirky tidbit. Sometimes, to get a darker shade of silk, dyers would use fermented plant baths that reeked like gym socks left in the sun. So while the finished robes looked divine, the workshop could smell like a prank gone wrong. And yet, this was considered normal. Beauty, apparently, always had its price. You move closer to the loom and see the shuttle darting back and forth like a dragonfly. Every so often, the weaver stops to adjust the tension, and the silence that follows feels as loud as a cymbal crash. Then, clack, the rhythm resumes. The floor trembles slightly with each strike, and you imagine this sound bleeding into the next courtyard, letting neighbors know that someone's weaving quota is on track. On the wall hangs a rack of finished fabric rolls, soft as clouds but stacked with soldierly precision. The mere sight of them makes you think of how many future sleeves, banners, and bed curtains they represent. Somewhere, someone is going to sleep under that fabric and never once wonder what it sounded like when it was born. A boy enters carrying more cocoons, his sandals squeaking on the polished floor, and you catch him humming to himself, a simple tune that somehow fits the loom's beat. You smile. If Spotify existed back then, you're sure someone would have made a Weaving Vibes playlist. As you step back toward the doorway, the combined noise of the spindles, reeling wheels, and loom fades into a warm chorus. The room feels alive, like a living instrument, each tool playing its part. The courtyard outside is brighter now, sunlight hitting the tiles, but you pause for one last listen, the rhythm of human hands turning insect thread into wealth, and then step back into the morning. The brightness outside feels sharper now, but you follow the earthy smell of clay to the next space, a shaded shed where the potters will sit like a throne. The air is cooler here, damp from yesterday's work, and the ground squishes softly under your feet. The first sound you notice is the low, steady whir of a foot-powered wheel. The potter presses the treadle with practiced rhythm, and the spinning disc sings in a way that makes you think of a lazy ceiling fan in summer. He slaps a lump of wet clay onto the wheel, thwack, and immediately the sound shifts, the spinning now carrying a squelchy undertone as his hands coax the clay upward. The sound is almost embarrassing, like someone stirring mac and cheese, but it's weirdly soothing. Historians still argue whether potters used wheels as early as the Shang dynasty for fine wares or only for bulk utilitarian jars, but either way, you're witnessing ancient innovation in action. The potter's rib tool rasps gently as he smooths the walls of the vessel, shaving off wet ribbons that fall with little splats. Each adjustment makes the wheel hum differently, as though the clay itself is singing back. You watch, hypnotized, until he pinches the neck closed and cuts the pot free with a string, the faint snick of cord against clay almost too quiet to catch. Nearby, apprentices knead clay with their heels, stomping rhythmically to expel air bubbles. Their feet slap the clay with wet smacks, and they giggle every time one of them loses balance. This is the quirky part. Some texts mention that kids were often recruited to do this because they were light enough not to ruin the clay but quick enough to keep up. Think of it as the ancient internship program, except paid in rice. Against the wall, half-dry pots wait for the kiln. When the wind moves through the shed, they make faint, hollow clinks as they knock together, like a room full of ceramic wind chimes. You crouch to look at their smooth sides, each one stamped with the potter's mark. It's weirdly touching, realizing that 2,000 years from now, archaeologists will dig these up and geek out over them like prized Pokémon cards. Suddenly, a hiss from outside tells you the kiln is open. You hurry out, the heat hitting you like a sauna door swinging wide. The kiln roars softly, the fire inside alive and crackling, sounding almost like a heavy storm. Someone pumps the bellows, whoosh, whoosh, and the flames brighten until they lick out of the flue. Sparks dance into the morning air, and you instinctively step back before your eyebrows get a surprise trim. The smell here is intense, smoke, charred pine, and hot clay baking into permanence. You hear a faint ping from inside the kiln, one of the pots settling as its glaze tightens. Potters say that's a good omen, like the clay's way of agreeing with the process. If it's a bad firing, though, the sound might be a crack, which is exactly as tragic as it sounds. Historians still argue whether these kilns were mostly family-owned or managed by state officials in large villages, but whatever the case, the whole operation feels like teamwork. Someone fetches more wood, another checks the airflow, and everyone keeps half an ear tuned to the firing sounds. This is as much listening as looking. As the heat grows unbearable, the potter steps back, satisfied, and leans against the wall to wipe his hands on his apron. The wheel has gone silent, but its ghostly spinning hum lingers in your ears. The shed smells now of drying clay and sweat, and you realize this room must have been both a workshop and a community hangout, because where else would you find this much unintentional ASMR in one place? You glance at the finished wares lined neatly nearby, water jars, rice bowls, even roof tiles stacked like pancakes. Their faint ringing when tapped is oddly musical, like each one is tuned to a different note. It's a clay symphony, silent until someone wakes it up. You step away, the roaring kiln fading behind you, and feel a quiet satisfaction. Pots may break, tiles may shatter, but this soundscape, the hum, the rasp, the roar, feels immortal. You leave the warmth of the kiln behind, but the next space might be even hotter. The air here smells like iron and sweat, and before you even see the blacksmith's forge, you hear it, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of hammer on metal. It's so loud you actually flinch, then grin because there's something satisfying about that sound. It's the audio equivalent of watching sparks fly in a Marvel montage. A smith works bare-armed at the anvil, his hammer ringing with each strike. The sound is sharp but not chaotic, perfectly timed as if he's drumming along to a beat only he knows. Each hit flattens the glowing lump into something useful, a knife, maybe, or a chisel. Historians still argue whether most villages had their own smith or relied on traveling specialists, but judging by the worn state of this anvil, this guy has been here a while. Beside him, a boy works the bellows with steady pulls. Whoosh, whoosh, the flames leap higher, licking around the crucible until the air shimmers. You can feel the heat even from several steps back, like opening an oven that's been preheating since yesterday. Every so often the bellows creak, sounding suspiciously like an old door hinge, and you imagine a younger apprentice oiling it with sesame oil just to keep the neighbors sane. The smell is metallic and smoky, a mix that stings your nose. Sparks shoot off the anvil and land in the dirt with tiny hisses, like fireflies with attitude. You try not to think about how easily one of those sparks could set your sleeve alight, because let's be honest, you'd make a terrible historical reenactor. At one side of the workshop, molds sit in a neat row, waiting. Bronze casting is still a thing here, and when the molten metal is finally ready, the smith pours it with astonishing calm. The liquid metal gurgles like a wicked hot soup, filling the molds with a hiss and a faint clink as it settles. The sound is almost holy, as if the earth itself is being reshaped into something permanent. And here's a fun, slightly bizarre tidbit: in some places, people supposedly sang to the metal as it cooled, believing it would make the finished blade stronger. Whether that worked or not is anyone's guess, but it definitely adds to the image of this forge as a full sensory experience: heat, sound, and now song. Once the casting cools enough to handle, the molds are cracked open with a satisfying tock tock tock, and the new bronze vessels or tools are revealed. They hit them lightly to test the ring. If it sings, the piece is good. If it thuds, well, back to the melting pot. It's basically ancient quality control with a soundtrack. You notice that every tool in here makes a distinct sound: the rasp of the file, the tap of the punch, the hiss of quenching metal in a water trough. The steam rises with a dramatic hitch, fogging the air for a second. It smells a little like wet pennies, but you kind of like it. Outside, a neighbor leans over the low wall to chat, raising his voice over the clamor. You catch a joke about the last time the smith accidentally set his own sleeve on fire, and everyone laughs, including the smith, who clearly hasn't lived it down yet. Ancient workplaces had their share of embarrassing stories too. Finally, the hammering slows. The smith plunges the glowing piece into the water for the last time, hisses, then lays it on the anvil to cool, the ringing echo lingering like the last note of a song. When it's quiet again, your ears buzz from the sudden lack of sound, as though the forge has been playing an entire concert just for you. You step back, hands still warm from the air, feeling oddly proud of the new tools and vessels lying in neat rows. These are the bones of the house, the instruments of work, the unsung heroes of everyday life. And somewhere in the distance, you hear another hammer strike, because this symphony never really stops. The heat of the forge fades as you step out into the open countryside. The smell of grass and wet earth greets you, and suddenly the soundscape changes: less metal, more wood, more water, more life. Somewhere ahead, a farmer calls to his ox, and you hear the groan of a wooden plow as it cuts into the soil. The creak of the harness, the soft squelch of wet dirt, and the grunt of the animal combine into a surprisingly soothing rhythm, like nature's version of a metronome. You walk toward the fields, careful not to trip over the little ridges of earth marking irrigation channels. The farmers wear broad hats, and you can hear the straw rustling every time the breeze picks up. Historians still argue whether these early wooden plows had iron tips during certain dynasties or were entirely wooden for centuries longer, but either way, they're effective enough to turn whole paddies into neatly furrowed rows. There's a steady shhk nearby, the sound of a hoe biting into the ground. A woman stands ankle-deep in mud, weeding between young rice shoots. Each stroke sends a tiny splash of water and mud, and the smell of wet soil is so strong you almost taste it. She hums under her breath, and the melody somehow fits perfectly with the repetitive scraping of the hoe. At the edge of the paddy, two boys take turns working a chain pump. The long bamboo tube tilts down, fills with water, then tips back up with a noisy splash into the next channel. The whole contraption creaks like an old rocking chair, and the splashes are almost playful, except these splashes mean the difference between a full harvest and an empty granary. Further along, a water wheel spins slowly, powered by the current of a small stream. It squeaks once every rotation, like a mouse complaining, but its buckets keep lifting water and pouring it where it's needed. You pause to watch, and the steady whoosh, dump, becomes strangely hypnotic, like the ticking of a giant clock. One quirky tidbit: farmers sometimes used ducks as living weeding machines, letting them paddle through the paddies and eat pests. You hear them quacking now, splashing around happily, completely unaware they're part of a sophisticated agricultural system. It's possibly the most eco-friendly sound you've heard all day. A farmer nearby sharpens his sickle with a whetstone, the rhythmic rasp almost as satisfying as the sound of the kitchen knife earlier. Sparks aren't flying this time, but you can tell from his careful pace that he's preparing for a long day of harvesting ahead. When he tests the edge on a stalk of grass, it slices cleanly with a soft snick, perfect. You notice a patch of beans drying on woven mats, the pods crackling softly in the sun. Every now and then one pops open with a tiny snap, scattering beans like nature's own gotcha machine. It's such a small sound, but in the quiet of the field, you catch it every time. Historians still argue whether irrigation technology spread from the north to the south or vice versa, but either way, the result is this rich, green expanse of food production stretching as far as the eye can see. You take a deep breath of the warm air, feeling oddly at peace with the idea that this same routine has played out for centuries, morning after morning, season after season. A distant temple bell rings noon, and the farmers pause for a moment. You can hear the ox breathing heavily, the water wheel continuing its lazy rotation, and the soft buzz of cicadas beginning their midday song. It's a symphony of work, one that will last until the sun dips low again. As you turn to leave the fields, a farmer waves, and you hear the cheerful bark of a dog somewhere behind him. The plow creaks once more, the chain pump splashes, and you feel like you're walking away from the heartbeat of the land itself. The countryside fades behind you, and soon you find yourself stepping into a long, shaded workshop that smells of sawdust and pine resin. The first sound that greets you is the faint, almost musical hiss of a plane gliding over wood. The carpenter moves with a calm precision, and each stroke leaves behind a curled shaving that spirals to the floor like a ribbon at a birthday party. The shavings pile up so thick you could probably use them as an early mattress. Just don't sneeze, unless you want to start the first ever historical confetti storm. A few steps away, another carpenter works a saw, its teeth biting into the plank with a steady zrrp, zrrp. The sound is as rhythmic as breathing, forward stroke, backward stroke, and you find yourself unconsciously matching your steps to it. Historians still argue whether frame saws were widely used before the Han Dynasty or only appeared later, but either way, this carpenter's saw sings like it's been doing this forever. Every so often, there's a sharper thunk. As a mallet comes down on a chisel, carving out a mortise joint. The echo bounces off the wooden beams of the shop, and the cut piece pops free with a satisfying talk. The craftsman smiles, as if even he can't resist how good that sound is. The air is full of tiny noises, the rasp of a file smoothing edges, the tap-tap-tap of nails being driven in, yes, nails, though many joints are still clever wood-to-wood connections, and the occasional grunt of someone wrestling with a stubborn beam. There's a comforting order to it all, as though the workshop is an orchestra and every tool knows its part. A boy in the corner is drilling a hole using a bow drill, and the squeak of the cord twisting and untwisting is oddly endearing, like a mouse doing tiny violin practice. The drill bit bites deeper with each cycle until it pops through the wood with a little sigh. Quirky fact for you, some carpenters supposedly licked their thumb and rubbed it on the wood to hear if it was smooth enough. The squeakier the rub, the finer the finish. Imagine ASMR influencers if they had been born in 200 BCE. The shop smells incredible, cedar, cypress, a faint hint of tung oil. Somewhere, a pot of glue warms over a tiny brazier, and you can hear the occasional bubble pop as it simmers. The carpenter dips a brush into the hot glue and paints it onto the joint with quick swipes, then presses two pieces together. When they click into place with a snug little clack, it's almost as satisfying as snapping Lego bricks together. Historians still argue whether standardized measurements were fully enforced across China during certain dynasties, but the carpenter here clearly trusts his straightedge and ink line. You hear the twang as he plucks the line and it snaps against the board, leaving a perfect chalk mark. That little twip is a sound that's barely changed in 2,000 years, you could hear it on a modern construction site tomorrow. Outside, you catch the muffled sound of a cart passing by, but inside the shop the focus stays on the wood. A finished stool gets set down with a proud thunk, and the carpenter runs his hand over the seat, nodding in approval. Even the approving grunt is part of the soundtrack here. You take one last look around before leaving, the shavings on the floor, the beams lined up like sleeping soldiers, the tools neatly hung on the wall. The whole place feels alive, as if every cut and scrape and tap has been absorbed into the wood. When you step outside, the sudden quiet feels almost too empty, as though you've left a busy concert mid-song. But as you walk away, you can still faintly hear the saw singing, the plane hissing, the chisels tapping, and it makes you wonder if these sounds once echoed through entire neighborhoods, reminder that life was being built one careful cut at a time. The scent of sawdust fades as you step into a quieter, almost reverent space. The floor is swept clean, the light comes through latticed windows in thin stripes, and the first sound you notice is a soft, rhythmic scraping. Someone is grinding ink on an inkstone. The stone gives a gentle rasp as the stick of soot and glue is worked in circles, releasing a rich, almost smoky scent. It's so subtle that you lean closer just to hear it better, like eavesdropping on a whisper. The scholar dips a brush into the newly made ink, and the sound it makes on silk or paper is surprisingly audible, a faint, papery hiss as the bristles drag and then lift. Each stroke is confident and slow, like he's coaxing the characters to reveal themselves rather than forcing them into existence. Historians still argue whether writing was something done by most literate members of society or left to a small educated elite, but either way, this man is clearly in the zone. You watch as a fresh sheet of bamboo slips is laid out on the table. Each slip clinks softly against the others as he ties them together with cord. The final knot is pulled tight with a small snick, and suddenly the whole piece feels like a sentence you could physically hold. In the corner, another man works on carving woodblocks for printing. The knife's tip scratches and rasps as he cuts negative space, flicking out tiny curls of wood that gather in little piles on the bench. The sound is sharper than the brushwork, like a tiny insect chewing away, and you can practically feel the precision in every stroke. When he finishes one character, he blows gently to clear the dust, PFF, and you get a whiff of pine and ink mixed together. One quirky tidbit: some scribes apparently use their own earwax as emergency glue when binding slips or mending brushes. It's both clever and a little gross, but hey, talk about recycling. The carved woodblocks are inked with a pad that makes a satisfying smack when pressed, and then the block is laid face down on paper. There's a soft rubbing sound as a baron, or even just a smooth hand, presses the ink into the sheet, and when the block is lifted, the page comes away with a faint peeling noise that feels like the reveal in an art video. A small boy nearby recites characters aloud as he copies them, his sing-song tone blending with the scratching of the brush. It's oddly soothing, the way work and learning blend into one ambient soundscape. Historians still argue whether block printing spread faster due to Buddhist texts or state edicts, but either way, the technology is already humming here, each sound adding up to a quiet revolution. You notice a scholar pause to fan himself, the paper fan making a soft whoop-whoop as it moves the hot summer air. The silence that follows is almost startling, broken only by the drip of water from a nearby jug into a basin, each drop a metronome for the writer's thoughts. When the brush is rinsed, the water swirls with black tendrils, and you hear the faint splash as he shakes it dry. Then he leans over, begins again, and the room resumes its careful symphony: grind, dip, hiss, breathe. As you leave, you glance back one last time and see the finished sheets hung to dry, fluttering slightly in the breeze. They rustle faintly, as though whispering their secrets to each other, and you smile. These sounds, stone on stone, knife on wood, brush on silk, are the quiet pulse of an entire civilization's memory. Stepping outside, you almost miss the louder world, but you carry the hush with you like a secret, ink still wet in your imagination. You follow the smell of something earthy and fragrant into a shaded corner of the house, where a low table is set with small clay cups, a kettle, and a bamboo tray. The first sound that greets you is a soft rustle as dry tea leaves are measured out by hand. They make a faint papery sich as they slide from the little scoop into the teapot, and you're immediately reminded of the sound of autumn leaves stirred by wind. A kettle sits nearby over a tiny brazier, and the water inside has just begun to sing. At first, it's only a faint whisper of bubbles forming. Ancient tea masters called this the crab-eye stage, but soon it grows into a rolling murmur. Glup glup glup. You can feel the steam rising, brushing against your face like a warm exhale. The host carefully lifts the kettle, and the sound of water pouring into clay is surprisingly musical, a hollow, ringing gurgle that makes you want to close your eyes just to listen. Historians still argue whether formal tea ceremonies developed during the Tang dynasty or had earlier folk roots, but the care with which this person moves suggests ritual is already a big deal. When the lid of the teapot is replaced, there's a neat little clack, followed by silence as the leaves steep. You can almost hear them unfurling, though maybe that's just your imagination running away with you. A few moments later, the host pours the first brew into a fairness cup, then into several small tasting cups. The liquid hits each one with a soft ting, like pouring glass marbles into a bowl. A faint breeze slips through the window, and the steam curls in the air, carrying the earthy, grassy smell of the tea toward you. One quirky tidbit. Early tea drinkers sometimes added onion or ginger to their brews, yes, onion tea, so if you think your latest trendy matcha latte is weird, history already beat you to it. Everyone raises their cups, and you hear a polite chorus of little slurps as the tea is sipped. The sound is actually encouraged, believed to enhance the aroma, though you still can't help but laugh at how it feels like a family noodle night. On the table, the clay cups are set back down with gentle talk sounds, their bases clicking softly on the bamboo tray. The host refills the pot for a second steep, and the water once again makes its hollow, gurgling song. Outside, somewhere, a bird calls, and the quiet of the tea corner makes the sound seem twice as loud. The room feels like it's holding its breath, every action deliberate, every sound magnified. Historians still argue whether tea in its earliest days was more medicine than refreshment, but as you sip, you can easily imagine this being both, a cure for fatigue and a tiny moment of peace in a noisy day. When the final cup is drained, the leaves are shaken out onto the tray with a wet little plop, and the kettle is set back on the brazier. The fire crackles softly, like it's sighing in satisfaction after doing its job. As you rise to leave, the host smiles and waves you on, the cups already clinking together as they are rinsed in a nearby basin. The water splashes softly, carrying away the last traces of bitterness, and the whole space feels refreshed, like the day itself has just taken a deep breath. Walking back into the courtyard, you catch yourself listening for the distant rumble of boiling water, as though every future cup of tea will now sound like an echo of this one. The calm of tea time lingers as you step out into the bright buzz of the local market street, and instantly the soundscape shifts again. The first thing you hear is the clatter of an abacus, beads snapping back and forth on their rods with sharp tack-tack-tack clicks. A shopkeeper's fingers fly over it so quickly you wonder if he's actually calculating or just performing a secret percussion solo to impress the neighbors. Right next to him, a set of bronze balance scales tips gently as a merchant weighs out a heap of grain. The pans settle with a faint metallic ting, then sway once more when a few more kernels are added. The entire process is weirdly dramatic for something as ordinary as measuring rice, like watching a reality show elimination round but for sesame seeds. Coins clink as payment is made, the round, square-holed cash pieces ringing against one another like tiny bells. A few are strung together on cord, making a soft CHRRR sound as they slide into place, ready to jingle on a belt. Historians still argue whether coins were more common than barter in rural markets at this time, but judging by the racket, there's plenty of metal changing hands here. Across the lane, a vendor scoops fermented tofu out of a jar, the ladle clanking against the rim with each scoop. A customer laughs at the strong smell, which, let's be honest, smells like a cheese shop and a gym bag had a very unfortunate date. You stifle a grin and edge closer to another stall where dried fish rustle as they're shifted on reed mats, making a papery crackle that somehow fits right into the market music. One quirky tidbit: some markets supposedly use giant wooden clappers at dawn to signal opening hours, almost like a rustic PA system. You imagine the sound echoing through the village, basically the "store is open" jingle of the ancient world. A butcher sharpens his cleaver on a whetstone, the SHHK sound slicing through the air before he brings it down with a satisfying thunk on a cutting block. The wooden board vibrates slightly with each strike, and you swear you can feel it through the soles of your feet. Children dart between stalls, their sandals slapping against the packed earth, and their giggles add a high, happy note to the overall soundscape. Somewhere, a storyteller bangs a wooden block to get attention, then launches into a tale. His voice rises and falls like music, punctuated by the occasional pop of roasted beans being sold by the handful nearby. Historians still argue whether market inspectors regularly patrolled these gatherings or only showed up for major tax days, but you notice one official with a bamboo tally stick counting sacks of grain. Every time he carves a new notch, the scraping sound is just loud enough to be heard over the crowd, a reminder that big government is always listening. You stop at a stall selling lacquered boxes, and when the lid is lifted, it gives a faint squeak as it rubs against the base. The merchant beams as though this sound alone proves its craftsmanship. As you walk deeper into the market, the abacus clicks continue in the background, joined by the rattle of grain scoops, the slap of wet vegetables being washed in buckets, and the calls of hawkers shouting today's deals. It's a full-on orchestra of commerce, and you can't help thinking that somewhere, a musician could make an entire percussion piece out of this one street. By the time you leave the market, the clatter has blended into a steady hum behind you, like the closing credits of a busy morning. You finger a coin in your pocket, listening to its faint jingle, and think, yes, this was the sound of wealth being made, one click and clink at a time. The market fades behind you, and now you find yourself walking through the outer gates of a bustling workshop district. The first thing that hits you is the constant, ringing clang of metal on metal, blacksmiths at their forges, hammers coming down in near-perfect rhythm. The air is hotter here, thick with the smell of coal and iron, and every blow sounds like a punctuation mark. Clang, hiss, clang. Each strike is followed by the hiss of quenching, glowing iron plunged into water with a dramatic ssssh that sends up a plume of steam big enough to make you flinch back. You edge closer to watch as a smith hammers a plowshare into shape. The ringing tone of the anvil seems to vibrate in your chest, like you've accidentally become part of the instrument. Historians still argue whether most farm tools were made locally in small smithies like this or imported from centralized foundries, but right now you're convinced this neighborhood could equip an entire province. Nearby, a different workshop is cutting bamboo, and the sound shifts from metallic ringing to a more woody, hollow tock-tock-tock. The craftsman splits a stalk with a single, satisfying crack, then smooths the edges with a knife that makes a whispering scrape. You can almost feel the shavings curling away as they fall to the floor. One quirky tidbit, some sources say smiths liked to sing while they worked, using the hammer rhythm as a kind of drumbeat. You strain your ears and think you do catch a faint chant, low and steady, perfectly matching the clang-clang like ancient work music. Across the way, a pottery workshop hums with its own sounds. A kick wheel spins with a soft whir as wet clay squelches and slaps under the potter's hands. The rhythmic thup-thup of wet clay being shaped is oddly hypnotic, and you could watch for hours. When a finished pot is lifted and set aside, it makes a hollow, resonant thump, as though the pot is proudly announcing its own completion. Historians still argue whether pottery workshops like these fired pieces daily or waited until kilns were full, but you happen to catch one being opened. The heavy door creaks, and the faint crackle of cooling pottery fills the air. Someone taps a bowl with a fingernail, and it gives off a clear, bell-like tone, basically ancient ceramic ASMR. Metal, wood, clay, every shop adds its own note to the industrial symphony. Even the rope makers get in on it, their strands creaking and twanging as they twist hemp into strong cords. The repetitive squeak of the wheel turning sounds almost like a lazy cricket. In a corner, a man tests a completed tool by striking it against a wooden post. The thwack echoes through the lane, followed by a satisfied grunt. Somewhere else, someone accidentally drops a hammer, and it lands with a loud clang that makes everyone look up for half a second before going back to work, like the ancient version of dropping a pan in a restaurant kitchen. As you move along, the air grows warmer, filled with overlapping layers of sound, hammer, hiss, crack, scrape, splash. You realize you're walking through the beating heart of productivity, where every sound means something is being shaped, built, or fixed. The final workshop you pass is making paper fans. Thin bamboo ribs rattle softly as they're gathered into bundles, and when the silk is glued to them, there's a faint sticky schlup as it's smoothed down. The finished fans flutter open with a delicate flop, almost like applause, as if congratulating all the other workers on a good day's labor. By the time you leave the district, your ears are ringing slightly, but in a good way, as though the echoes of hammers and wheels are still forging shapes in your imagination. You glance back once and see the rising column of kiln smoke, the sparks flying from the forges, and you can almost hear the next clang waiting to fall. Leaving the heat of the workshops behind, you follow a winding path to the edge of a rice paddy, and suddenly the soundscape shifts to something wetter, softer, and oddly musical. The first sound you catch is the steady splash of wooden sandals in mud as farmers plant seedlings in long, perfect rows. Each step makes a squelchy slop followed by a gentle ripple of water that spreads like a sigh. Nearby, a water wheel creaks steadily, its paddles dipping into the stream with a low whomp, whomp rhythm. The wooden axle groans faintly as it turns, lifting water into bamboo pipes that clatter as they spill it into the paddy. Historians still argue whether these irrigation systems were developed locally or inspired by earlier technologies from other regions, but either way, they're brilliantly efficient, and very satisfying to listen to. You pause to watch a farmer swinging a wooden rake through the shallows, the tines making a wet, slurping shrrk as they smooth the mud. The handle creaks as it twists, sounding exactly like an old floorboard complaining underfoot. One quirky tidbit: some accounts say farmers trained ducks to patrol their paddies, eating pests and weeds while leaving the rice untouched. You spot a few waddling nearby, quacking softly as they splash through the water like the original organic pest control squad. Their quacks echo off the hills, oddly cheerful, like they're singing encouragement to the farmers. The scene isn't completely quiet. Someone nearby is pounding rice in a large mortar, the wooden pestle landing with a heavy thud that reverberates through the ground. The grains rustle as they shift with each strike, creating a crunchy undertone to the deep bass beat. Historians still argue whether communal labor in rice paddies was voluntary cooperation or government-organized corvée, but everyone here seems to be working in sync, calling out to each other in a rhythm that almost sounds like song. Their voices carry over the fields, blending with the creak of yokes as oxen pull plows through wetter sections, the mud squelching like a giant pot of soup. A breeze stirs, and the tops of nearby reeds rustle with a dry, whispery sound. You catch a faint hum of insects too, the drone of cicadas rising and falling like a background track. Every sound seems to have its own place, nothing too sharp, nothing too loud. At the far end of the field, a water buffalo shakes its head, its bell jangling with a soft clonk-clonk. The farmer guiding it clicks his tongue, a quick tisk-tisk, and the animal trudges forward, hooves making a slow, steady schlop. You crouch down and touch the water, cool and smooth, and listen to the faint trickling of irrigation ditches. Somewhere a child laughs as a frog leaps from the bank with a wet plop. Even here, work feels threaded with play. One farmer pauses to sharpen his sickle on a stone, and the scraping sound cuts through the air like a whispering saw. Then he tests the edge with a thumb and nods in satisfaction before heading back to cutting grass for the buffalo. When the sun begins to sink, the sounds soften further. The water wheel still turns, but more slowly now, the voices grow quieter, and even the ducks seem to calm down, just a few contented quacks before they settle for the night. As you turn to leave, the paddy reflects the golden sky, and you hear one last perfect plop as a bubble rises and bursts. You smile, realizing that even in silence, this place would still have a pulse, the gentle heartbeat of water and earth working together. The quiet rhythm of the paddy still echoes in your ears as you step into the dense green of a nearby forest. At first, it feels almost too still, just the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird, but soon you pick up the faint chop of someone at work. Following the sound, you find a woodcutter swinging his axe in slow, steady arcs. Each strike lands with a sharp thunk, followed by the cracking sound of fibers giving way. The tree shudders slightly with each blow, and you can almost feel the vibration through the ground. The forest amplifies every noise, the grunt of effort, the squeal of the axe handle as it twists, the creak of branches as they sway. Historians still argue whether logging was strictly regulated by the state during certain dynasties or handled more casually by local communities, but either way, it's clear this is serious business. Eventually, with a groaning crack, the tree gives way and crashes down with a booming whomp that sends birds flapping noisily into the sky. The sudden silence afterward is almost eerie, as if the whole forest is taking a breath. Nearby, two men are sawing through a fallen trunk with a two-person saw. The blade bites into the wood with a rhythmic scree-scree, pulling out long curls of sawdust that smell faintly sweet. One quirky tidbit: some early Chinese carpenters used tools with built-in spirit levels, basically ancient bubble levels, which meant they could get their beams perfectly straight without eyeballing. Imagine the plink of water inside a tiny tube guiding the cut. The logs are hauled to a clearing, where they're split with wedges and mallets. Each hammer strike gives a hollow bonk, followed by a satisfying crack as the wood splits cleanly. Chips fly, landing with faint ticks in the undergrowth. Farther down the path, you spot a bamboo grove, and the sound changes entirely. Bamboo is cut with quick, decisive strokes, each stalk giving a resonant talk as it falls. When the hollow canes hit the ground, they make a distinctive clop, like knocking on a drum. Historians still argue whether bamboo was more commonly used for building, tools, or writing materials at this point in history, but here it seems destined for all three. A boy nearby is already trimming a length into thin strips, the knife rasping as it peels away the outer layer. As you watch, he bundles the strips together, and they rattle softly as he ties them with vine cord. The whole process feels like music: chop, crack, scrape, rattle, and you find yourself walking in step with the rhythm. At the edge of the clearing, charcoal burners are at work, stacking logs into a conical mound. The logs knock against one another with a hollow tock-tock, then are covered with earth that crumbles down with a soft hiss. Soon smoke begins to rise, carrying a sharp, almost sweet smell that stings your nose. The fire inside pops and crackles faintly, like distant fireworks. You pause to lean against a tree and just listen. The wind sighs through the leaves, the forest birds call in quick, fluting notes, and somewhere a woodpecker taps a rapid tack-tack-tack like it's keeping time for the entire woodland crew. By the time you leave, the sun is lower, turning the tree trunks gold. The sounds seem to slow too, axes less frequent, saws quieter, as though the forest itself is winding down. You take one last deep breath, smelling resin, sap, and smoke, and step back onto the path. The forest keeps working behind you, its soundtrack fading into the distance but still echoing in your mind. The earthy smell of the forest fades as you approach the edge of a riverbank, where a completely different soundscape takes over. The first thing you hear is the slap of water against wooden hulls, fishing boats rocking gently as they're tied to the pier. A fisherman hauls in a net, the wet ropes squeaking as they slide over the side, followed by a satisfying splash as a silver fish flops against the deck. You step closer and hear the soft swish of reeds brushing together in the breeze. A fisherman rhythmically beats the water with a long bamboo pole, creating loud whaps to scare fish toward his net. Historians still argue whether this method was used everywhere or just in certain regions, but it's remarkably effective, and noisy. Another man is mending his net, pulling twine tight with a quick twip as each knot is secured. The net itself rustles softly, like a curtain being shaken out. One quirky tidbit: some river communities trained cormorants to fish, fitting them with little collars so they couldn't swallow the catch. You spot one perched on the gunwale, shaking water off its feathers with a vigorous shhh and giving a throaty croak as though demanding a raise. Farther down, a woman washes clothes on a flat stone. Each slap of wet fabric makes a smack that echoes across the water, followed by the splash of rinse water being tossed back into the river. It's strangely satisfying to listen to, like watching someone power wash a driveway but with more rhythm. In the shallows, kids hunt for shellfish, laughing as they find one and toss it into a basket with a soft clack. You crouch and hear the tiny gurgle of water running between stones, the occasional plop of a frog leaping in. Historians still argue whether river ferries were state-run or private enterprises, but you spot a flat-bottomed boat taking passengers across. The ferryman uses a long pole that pushes off the riverbed with a deep thump, then creaks as he leans his weight into it. The boat glides with a faint, watery hiss, almost silent except for the occasional slap of a paddle correcting its course. Near the pier, a cooper is at work making barrels for storing fish. His mallet strikes the staves with a resonant tock-tock, and when he fits the iron hoop, it gives a bright metallic ping as it snaps into place. The finished barrel is rolled with a hollow rumble toward the dock. One fisherman suddenly calls out and everyone cheers. His net comes up heavy, flapping with a whole school of fish that hit the deck in a wet percussion of flap flap flap. The air smells strongly of river mud and scales, and you wrinkle your nose but can't help smiling. As the sun sinks lower, the river sounds grow calmer. Nets are hung to dry, dripping water with soft plink-plink sounds that almost resemble wind chimes. The ferryman ties up his boat, the rope creaking as it's cinched, and the last paddle strokes fade into ripples. You take a seat on a smooth stone and just listen. Frogs croak in chorus, insects hum, and the river itself seems to sigh as evening settles. The world feels slower here, like the current is carrying all the day's noise downstream, leaving behind just this soft lullaby of water and wood. When you finally stand to leave, the cormorant gives one last raspy squawk as though saying goodbye, and you step back onto the road with wet-sounding footsteps, carrying the river's rhythm with you. You follow the road until the low hum of voices draws you toward the heart of a village. Evening is settling in, but instead of silence, the place is alive with sound. The first thing you catch is the crackle of a cooking fire as someone tosses fresh kindling on the embers. It flares with a quick whoosh, sending sparks spiraling upward. The smell of wood smoke and sizzling oil hits you at the same time, making your stomach growl. Around a communal hearth, neighbors are gathered, each adding ingredients to a shared pot. You hear the plop of vegetables being dropped in, followed by the gentle blub-blub of boiling broth. Someone stirs it with a long spoon, the handle tapping the pot with a hollow clink every few turns. Nearby, a stone mill is being worked by two people, one pushing, one pulling. The stone makes a gritty gur-gur-gur sound as soybeans are ground into paste. Historians still argue whether these mills were common household tools or reserved for community use, but the teamwork here feels like an ordinary nightly routine. Children chase each other through the dust, their bare feet slapping against the packed earth. Their laughter rises like birdsong, mixing with the rhythmic tap-tap of someone playing a simple tune on a bamboo flute nearby. The melody winds through the air, turning the whole scene into something almost cinematic. One quirky tidbit: some villages reportedly had night watch drums or clappers that the watchman struck as he made his rounds. You hear it now, talk, talk, a slow, steady beat letting everyone know the hour and that the streets are safe. A weaver sits at her loom, which creaks and clicks as the shuttle flies back and forth. The threads make a faint twang every time they're tightened, and you imagine entire blankets being born from this quiet rhythm. At another corner, someone is pounding dough, the heavy wooden pestle hitting with a deep thump that echoes off the walls. Each impact is followed by the soft sticky sound of the dough folding over itself. You half expect someone to yell, "Order up," as if you've wandered into the world's oldest bakery. Historians still argue whether communal cooking gatherings were purely practical or also social rituals, but judging by the chatter and laughter, this feels as much about company as about dinner. The air buzzes with overlapping voices, occasional bursts of gossip, and the kind of belly laughs that leave everyone wiping tears from their eyes. Someone opens a wine jar, and the clay lid lifts with a hollow pop. Cups are filled, and the clink of ceramic against ceramic rings out in a little toast. Soon the first sips are taken with audible slurps, followed by satisfied sighs. The night grows darker, but lanterns are lit with soft woofs, their paper sides glowing like warm moons. The crickets outside grow louder, forming a kind of night orchestra to accompany the chatter. As you sit down by the fire, someone passes you a bowl, the wooden rim smooth and warm in your hands. You sip, and the broth makes a soft sip-sip sound before the flavor hits, salty, rich, exactly what you didn't know you needed. By now the fire has burned lower, giving off occasional pops as embers collapse in on themselves. The whole village feels wrapped in a blanket of shared sound, pots bubbling, looms clicking, flutes singing, laughter rolling like waves. You lean back, full and drowsy, and watch sparks float into the night sky. The night watch clapper sounds again, slower now, as though it too is getting sleepy. This is the quiet joy of village life, where every sound belongs and every noise tells you you're home. The night is fully set now, but sleep hasn't claimed the village yet. You wander toward a courtyard where a small group has gathered for what looks like the highlight of the evening, storytelling. The first sound you notice is the sharp talk of a wooden clapper, the storyteller's way of commanding silence. The crowd hushes instantly, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the occasional pop from a nearby brazier. He begins to speak, his voice rising and falling in a practiced rhythm that draws everyone closer. The story is punctuated by the swish of his sleeve as he gestures dramatically, and occasionally by the chuckle or gasp of the audience. Historians still argue whether these tales were mostly historical epics or fantastical myths, but tonight seems to be a little of both. There's a general, a dragon, and a punchline that makes everyone laugh. Somewhere nearby, a drummer taps a slow, steady beat on a frame drum to underscore the tale. Thumb, thumb, thumb. It's so soft you almost feel it more than hear it, like a second heartbeat. A young musician plucks a few notes on a pipa, the strings giving a liquid, bell-like tone that seems to shimmer in the air. One quirky tidbit: some storytellers reportedly used painted scrolls, unrolling them panel by panel as they narrated. You swear you catch a rustling sound as this man unrolls something on the table, revealing a painted scene that makes the kids gasp. The audience shifts on their mats, the woven reeds rustling in unison. A dog barks once in the distance, then settles down with a soft huff. Even the ducks from the paddy seem to have gone to sleep, just a single sleepy quack breaks the quiet before fading again. As the story reaches its climax, the storyteller stamps his foot, making the little wooden platform echo. Then, with a final talk of the clapper, he bows and declares it done. The applause is gentle, mostly a ripple of hands against knees, a soft chorus of approval rather than a roar. Gradually, people rise, their sandals whispering against the dirt as they head home. The fire crackles lower, sending one last spray of sparks into the dark sky. Someone yawns loudly enough to make everyone laugh, and the sound lingers like a bell as the crowd disperses. You walk back through the quiet lanes, hearing only the faint creak of gates closing, the slosh of water poured from jars for tomorrow's use, and the night watch clapper sounding once more in the distance, its beat now slow and almost drowsy. By the time you reach the edge of the village, the sounds of the day are gone. All that's left is the chirp of insects, the occasional bark of a far-off dog, and the hush of wind through the trees. The world feels soft, padded, as though it's wrapped itself in its own blanket. Now that the village has grown quiet, let yourself slow down too. Imagine standing just outside the gate, looking back one last time. The lanterns glow faintly in the distance, their paper sides swaying gently, and every sound has stretched into something long and lazy. Even the frogs by the river seem to be calling at half speed. You take a deep breath. The night air is cooler now, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The crickets keep up their chorus, steady and patient, like a lullaby you've always known but somehow forgotten until tonight. You start to walk away, but your steps are slower, softer. Each one seems to sink into the dust with barely a sound, like you're trying not to wake the world. Picture the tools you saw today, the abacus, the millstone, the hammer, the fan, and imagine them all at rest. The abacus beads no longer click, the forge has gone dark, the paper fans are folded and still. Even the water wheel has slowed, its creak becoming just an occasional sigh. The moon is high now, painting the paddy silver. You can almost hear the soft rustle of rice leaves in the night breeze, like a whisper saying everything is safe, everything is cared for. Let that thought settle over you like a blanket. The sounds of ancient China have faded, but they've left you with something warm, a memory of work well done, of shared meals, of stories told under the stars. Take one more slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. If you listen closely, maybe you'll still hear a faint talk of the storyteller's clapper, somewhere far away, reminding you that tomorrow will bring new sounds, new stories, but for now, it's time to rest.